Well, thanks, Charles, and thanks for inviting me to this forum. If it does happen to be an ongoing talk, I hope that I can join you guys again. I'm almost embarrassed to admit how much of my career I've spent with the issue of dealing with residual contamination, or as I often call it, dealing with the institutional controls. Charles asked me to do an overview, a brief overview of residual contamination, and then to move into the ASTM, Continuing Obligations Guide, which I helped chair, and it focuses largely on managing residual contamination. And then to, time permitting, go into some Teradx LandWatch best practice examples of how technology helps with residual contamination management in different use case scenarios. So with that, in a nutshell, residual contamination is, routine now. We all know this. Cleanups allow residual contamination all the time. Institutional control use is really common, and they need to work. Before I kind of go into this, everyone is familiar with institutional controls, or is anybody not? I don't want to sort of go into excruciating detail if it doesn't. I don't need to. But in California, institutional controls in a nutshell, the way I think of them, are pieces of paper, documents that say what can and can't be done at a piece of property, usually after it's been cleaned up. In California, they take the form of land use covenants. Those are covenants that get filed in chain of title. No further action letters with conditions that say you're clean as long as X, Y, and Z. If X, Y, and Z happens, then we can reopen this, etc. Usually, don't excavate, or if you excavate, make sure you have proper precautions in place. And then sometimes, but less often, government ordinances with a cleanup will say, this cleanup relies on the fact that there's a well permitting ordinance that makes sure that no new wells are going to go in, or something like that. And then sometimes there are less formal institutional controls, like closure plans that aren't necessarily legally binding, but there's still a control in place to help make sure that the wrong stuff doesn't happen to the residual contamination. These institutional controls are perplexing for some reason, and it's still, I've been in the area for 15 years. There's 2 books on the subject written by the American Bar Association. The second edition came out, I think, 6 months ago, trying to grapple with, how to handle institutional controls. Maybe 10 years ago, the big question was like, what are these things anyway, and how can they, as a legal matter, even work? How can we make sure that when you write a document that it goes on forever and ever, and whenever people are buying and selling property, that they need to obey these things? Those issues, particularly in California, are better understood now. And California's had Civil Code Section 1471 for a while, which says, when you draft a land use covenant, we feel pretty confident that it's enforceable. More recently, the evolution of this topic, the perplexing nature, is really about how to make sure that there's compliance. It's one thing for a legal document to exist and say, you shall not dig below 10 feet because below 10 feet the soil is dirty or whatever. But it's another thing to actually make sure. And I like to step back and get esoteric for a second. When you think about property and the types of things that you can't do at property, like you can't dig in wetlands, or you can't excavate more than an acre usually without a stormwater management plan, and you can't destroy the habitat of endangered species. There's typically a pretty decent process in place to make sure that, for example, people don't dig up wetlands. They have their problems, but when you go to a building department or a whole host of other activities, there's usually people in there along the way going, if this is a wetland, make sure you go to the Army Corps or what have you. In the area of institutional controls, where there's piecemeal properties with maybe a covenant or some other document recorded saying you shouldn't dig below 10 feet or you shouldn't put a daycare here, we haven't quite got to that level of sophistication, which is why it continues to be a perplexing problem. And as a sidebar, which is why the company I work for exists, because this private company sort of facilitates through technology to make sure that people don't do the things that institutional controls say they shouldn't, because the government infrastructure isn't quite there yet. And some of the examples that we're going to go into, I think, in more detail show how there's certain efforts going with counties and states working together to to try to assure institutional control compliance. And they're good examples of the steps that are happening here and actually in other states as well. Even while it's perplexing, I've used this slide for a long time, people know that, okay, if you have an institutional control, which like I said is this piece of paper, I like that bill from Schoolhouse Rock, because I think the whole "I'm just a bill, can I be a law" thing is good by analogy, because the piece of paper is useful, but the need to directly inspect it, visiting the site or whatever from time to time, or to communicate the controls during the buying and selling of property, or to communicate it during land use activities like building permits and excavations and drilling wells. Those are all the things where the rubber sort of hits the road, and those are all the parts of the institution which are still fledgling. Land use and land activities happen, though, and this is just one slide from the Terradex process. This is in a different state, but what it shows is a bunch of excavations that we were monitoring for over, I think, just about 6 months that occurred across this cleanup site. And in that case, we were alerting people to make sure that the excavation wasn't actually going too deep or doing the wrong thing. But the point is, and I have lots and lots of examples like this. I can assure you, at the majority of cleanup sites, particularly in urban areas, things are happening. Recognizing this, and still sort of, in the spirit of trying to fix the perplexing issue, the EPA's effort at the federal level, I think, is a good example of the evolving nature of the problem. Just last December, so a couple months ago, they issued 2 new guidances, and about a year before that, a third one, which tend to focus on how to, like I said, how to assure that this residual management or the institutional controls covering them are complied with over time. Particularly, what are the roles of the different stakeholders? There's, going back for a second, there's a place in this whole mess, if you will, for the responsible party, for the new owner, if there is a new owner, for perhaps local governments, although people disagree about that, perhaps the state government, perhaps utility workers. There's a lot of folks as stakeholders particularly in this, and so part of the problem is in how to formulate a process where, given all these moving parts, the wrong things don't happen, which is what EPA tries to do. I mean, they only can do so much because of the legal framework they have. So they issue guidances explaining how it's important for these institutional control plans, kind of like a post-closure plan, to lay out who's responsible for what over time. And when you do inspect and audit a residual contamination site, what are the kinds of things you should do? So those guidances are new and useful, but still, still evolving. So ASTM, Continuing Obligations Guide. I'm sort of segueing into part 2 of my talk. Let me check my time here. How am I doing? Okay. So this guide came about really because of the CERCLA Brownfield Amendment. So I'll just go right to that, which said that, I'm sorry if you know this, but this is going back to 2002. People can now buy property knowing that it's contaminated and not be off the hook for liability. It's a little bit like if you're familiar with California's AB 389, very similar. It's like, as long as I can buy it and I can know about that, and I can still be free from federal CERCLA liability, as long as, and this is where the continuing obligations come in, as long as I do certain things. So these people here, the bona fide prospective purchaser, they're the guy who buys the property, knowing it's contaminated, but knowing that they're going to do the right, responsible things moving forward. And I think it's best to focus on that, because other categories of owners, innocent landowners, and neighboring or contiguous property owners just sort of muddies the water at this stage. That's why I put this little arrow here, because that's really where things are focused. So the CERCLA amendments, they say that well, once you buy property, then you are okay. You won't be liable under CERCLA for the cleanup costs as long as you take certain continuing obligation steps. The primary 2 of which, but there are others, include steps to manage the releases that might exist in a responsible manner, and then to comply with the institutional controls. So you might be thinking, well, okay, that's federal CERCLA, so why does that really matter, to your run-of-the-mill? But it does matter, because what happens, and there's actually cases in California, what happens is that new property owners buy property, and then sometimes there's an issue, and all of a sudden it gets way more expensive to clean it up than they thought. So they go back and they try to sue the prior owner. They go, hey, this is your mess, help me pay for it. And then the new owner goes, well, okay, but you have to help too, because you're also a liable party. And then the new owner goes, well, no, I'm not a liable party, because look, there's BFPP and I'm doing my continuing obligations. And then the prior owner goes, no, but you're not doing them right. So since you're not doing them right, you actually are a liable party. And that fight is played itself out just a few times. I mean, this is a relatively new thing. So the one case I know about in California, the new owner won, and he actually was held to have done a pretty good job, even though there was an underground tank in place for about a year while they were doing things. The court in that case said, you know what, you were being responsible, you were trying to clean it up, that was okay. But in other states, and there's some big cases going on right now, the new owner has not been so lucky, causing people to really worry. So that is why that CERCLA regime is where the continuing obligation ASTM guide standard came in. The question really was, well, how do I know what to do? How do I know what's a reasonable step or responsible management? And how do I know what it takes to comply with an institutional control so I'm okay? And that's what this group that I helped chair spent 5 years working on, and to be quite honest with you, I think partially got it right, but there's consensus-based processes are sometimes not perfect. So there's things that if I was doing it myself, I would do different. But of course, everybody on the board would probably say that. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of it. The whole idea of continuing obligations is it picks up where a phase one kind of leaves off. So it assumes that you've done your all appropriate inquiry, and before you bought property, that you've taken all the proper steps. And before I go into it, let me just sidebar and tie this back to release management for a second. Because if you remember all the pieces of potential stakeholders in the release management, residual management scenario, one of them included the prior owner and the current owner, sort of the RPs and the new owner. And then other stakeholders are potentially the government regulators and so forth. This, both the Brownfield amendments and this continuing obligations guide recognize that there's a role, and they try to stress that there should be a role on the private party who's either used to own or owns the site. So the idea is don't rely on government. You have certain obligations to comply with institutional controls or otherwise manage releases in a responsible way, because if you don't, then you potentially could be liable for whatever cleanup costs are there. Again, the idea is hey, this is not all about government managing this forever. We need some private sector involvement. So going back to these 4 steps, then attempt to walk that person through the right thing to do. And it's step 1 is just make sure you. Step 1, recognize that you have a phase 1 and you've come to this property knowing something about its past. Step 2 says, well, phase 1 is one thing. That's all about just doing enough to know whether contamination exists when you buy a property. But step 2 is really know it. We're not saying it has to be cleaned up, but do enough to really know what your site's about so you know what the institutional controls are or the release management issues. Then, when you know that, then step 3 involves actually performing continuing obligations, which is split into stuff that occurs, right when you buy the property, maybe for the first year or two, where it's perhaps being cleaned up, or perhaps just getting ready for redevelopment, and then secondly splits into sort of over many years when there's residual contamination, managing it, and in particular complying with the institutional controls. And then finally putting that together in a piece of paper in the form of a continuing obligations plan, and then some monitoring reports along the way, so there's documentation that you've fulfilled these processes. So I've kind of went through all the steps, but again, step 1 and step 2 is are there recognized environmental conditions based on your phase 1? Are there institutional controls there? Really know your site. The guide itself lists baseline sources of information that you should look to and some special sources of information that you should look to. You can see the number on here, and ASTM's website has the guide. I mean, there's lots of details I can't possibly go through here. Steps 3 and 4 then are more focused on doing the continuing obligations. Whatever those might be and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the types that are particular to institutional controls or ICs. And then there's steps with respect to, just managing tanks that need to get pulled out or whatever. So the ongoing obligations, the slides I'm about to show really focus on the institutional control component. So let me just say that going back to those cases, there's guidance in this ASTM guide, and to some extent in these case laws, these cases that are popping out, talking about what a person ought to do during the time when they buy a site to the time when it gets cleaned up, if they happen to be in that situation. And the other situation is a buyer who buys a site that's already been cleaned up and just has an institutional control. That happens. But when it happens that you're buying a site knowing it's dirty and you want to redevelop it, and maybe you're working with the state regulatory agency, maybe you're not, there are certain things that need to be done in order to maintain the CERCLA liability freedom. And that's what those tend to be things like, if there's a continuous leak in a tank, yank it right away. I'm using informal terms. If there's a release moving through the property, get rid of it right now. If there's tanks that are open, all the bad stuff. And the case law sort of fine tunes it. And like I said, in California, the issue was like, well, if there was the underground tank with, I think it was an inch of I forget if it was solvent or petroleum for a year, and maybe a little bit of leaked out. Was that not responsible enough to fail the reasonable step prong? In that case, the court said it was okay. So there's these nuanced issues that are tough calls, but the ASTM guide tries to navigate a person through that. And it essentially says, if you put a plan together in place and you meet it, that's probably your best course of action. With respect to the institutional controls, and this gets to the scenario where you either bought it when it's cleaned up and all it has is some institutional controls in place, or you've gotten the property successfully to a place where now all you have is some land use controls in place that need to be monitored. The guide goes through some examples and says the types of auditing and monitoring that ought to be done at annual or biannual frequency, depending. Like checking for whether there's excavation into engineered caps. There's other examples, like it recommends perhaps using a one-call system to make sure you're finding out about excavations. It talks about reviewing permits and daycare licenses to make sure that those things aren't occurring if they shouldn't be, and building permits tend to show evidence of a new building going up, and sometimes institutional controls say, no new construction. So it gives examples of the kinds of things that ought to be done, like checking for zoning ordinances that a remedy relied on a particular zoning, and if that changes, and so forth. EPA's guidance, and I just want to quickly point out about 5-year reviews, which is really of the same spirit, and it speaks to the EPA regulator when they once every 5 years go to their site or to the PRP, what sorts of institutional control things they ought to look for. And even though the EPA's guidance came out after ASTM, the EPA stuff is right on par. I mean, they talk about changes in land use or zoning, in this case, changes in groundwater or surface water use, looking at exposure pathways. I mean, the idea is to go to your site and do some paper research to find out that the things that aren't supposed to be happening actually aren't happening. Some cases call for looking all the time, or once a month, or even on a daily basis, which is what our company does. Some sites maybe once a year, once every few years is fine. And then again, like I said, the ASTM guide recommends documenting that into a plan. So let me see how my time is going. I'm at 19 minutes. Should I just do 5 more minutes? Okay. So let me take a breath. So I covered residual management, generally, and institutional control issues, hopefully in a way that made sense. Covered the ASTM guide and making the point that really the whole point of the ASTM guide is to put some process in place for a private landowner to manage the site and the institutional controls. So now I'm going to show some technology tools that Teredex has developed that help do this. The idea behind Teredex came, this is why I joined these guys 3 years ago after knowing the space for 15 years, is recognizing that it's really hard to know whether there are things happening in a property that shouldn't happen. So it had in mind the state regulator primarily, or the landowner, both of whom have the same interest of assuring that the things that aren't supposed to happen actually don't happen. The people who tend to be attracted to what I call that core function of Teredex are state agencies and large-scale property owners, like big companies that might have hundreds of a portfolio of hundreds of properties with residual management across the country. So they want to know that there's no building permits being issued, or there's no excavation occurring that ought not to be occurring. Just like a state, in the case, and we do actually work for California, who has, I think, 400, well, that's DTSC, I mean, 400 covenants in force that they want to know whether the things that the covenant says not to do actually aren't happening. So we tend to monitor things like real estate listings for sale and an actual chain of title for change of ownership, because that's always an important thing in the area of IC assurance. We tend to monitor for building permits and zoning changes, for excavation clearances. That's a biggie. Excavation is a telltale sign of things happening at property. And for licenses and permits, like daycare licenses. There's lots and lots of things. The list goes on. But the gist is that the process that we undertake, which reaches out through electronic means, a host of different data, into a host of different data sources that are keeping track of land activity for other purposes, even the kind of stuff that you hear about on the radio. You hear about the building permits being representative of the economy. Those types of data sources we repurpose to turn them into alerts, kind of like a smoke alarm to the people we happen to be working for, like the state or the regulators. Say, hey, there's a building permit being applied for at your site, and they're putting up a commercial building. This is something you wanted to know about, so here you go. That's the gist of it. I said that there was a regulator sort of use case and a responsible party use case. That's kind of where we started. And more lately, we've developed some things that pertain specifically to a local government agency who's trying to keep track of what's going on in their own boundaries. And then we have some tools focused directly on the excavation scenario, since that's such a big deal. I can't overemphasize how the keeping track of the excavation events is such a valuable thing to do in order to properly assure institutional controls. So let me just pick. I have 3 different technologies to go through, and since I have about 6 minutes, I'm just going to pick, I think, one, and then if we have time later, I'll go back to the other. Let me go. I'll do I'm going to skip the local government use case for now. But in a nutshell, at the click of a mouse, it allows the permitter or planner to see the Teredex created website of all the cleanup sites and all the institutional controls in their city. I don't have the slides right here. I'd have to pull up another slide, which is why I'm going to do it later. But again, we're running this on a pilot scale in Palo Alto and a couple other cities where. And it's a new thing, so it's because cities, some of you are probably in cities, aren't typically in the business of monitoring institutional controls. But at the same time, they do say, well, we do kind of want to know if we're issuing a permit at a site that the state or the federal government has said is contaminated. So we reach out to the 5 or 6 different data sources: federal, EPA, DOD, the 2 or 3 at the state level, Water Board, DTSC, and then all the really hard ones like the NFA letters that say you're clean as long as these things don't happen. And we pull that together for the city, and then they bring it into their GIS system if they have one, and then they can just click on it. It's a layer that goes next to all of their stuff that says, they know their zoning and their parcels, and then they can see on top of that the environmental information, so that they know right away if their decision that they're about to make is impacting institutional control. If we have time, I could show you some slides on that. But for the regulators, like Koopas, but really we have the people that we work for at the state level, state of New York, state of California, or like I said, big portfolio property owners. The idea is to set them up so all their sites, all their institutional control sites are on a nice place where they can go visit. We monitor, we alert them through an electronic chain, and then we help them manage the process of should they do something because of the alert, and we keep track of all that sort of stuff. So I'll just quickly show kind of some screenshots of how that works. So you can imagine you're at your desk, you're a person at a big company with hundreds of properties or a regulator, and you go, let me log in, let me type my username in, and then let me see my portfolio of sites. These are the sites I have institutional controls on, for example, and I want to monitor. I go to my address, typical stuff. Oh, okay, and then I can see the parcels. These are for people who wouldn't otherwise maybe know them. If they know them, then that's fine. And then I can see, we keep track of ownership, so I can see who owns the parcel. And then they can go, and what we have done is taken all the relevant environmental documents, and they can see what the chemicals of concern are. They can see what the institutional controls say not to do, which is really the core of things. And then they can see if there are relevant documents. We have them there for them. Some people say, don't worry about it, we got our documents. Sometimes people go, yeah, that's really cool if we can have the documents right there. So they have a place where they can just easily see the 400, the 500, the 100 institutional control, residual management sites, and what the issues are, so that when we monitor and alert, that information's handy. So we reach out, like I said, into 5 or 100 sources, and sort of like a smoke alarm or someone who's trying to protect your identity or whatever, and by analogy, we're always searching. And when we find something that conflicts with institutional control, we send an alert via email, and the alert, you click a link and the alert pops up, and it shows your site. It shows usually a short statement going, there's an excavation, there's a building permit, and then it opens a chat box, and we start dialoguing. Depending on who the client is, it goes different ways. So I'll just, what states tend to do is they tend to take control at that point, because they're going to go, we're the regulators, we got it, thank you for telling us. And they'll say, this is just an example, there's lots of different ways they can go, but they'll say, well, let me type in some language I want, and let me issue an automatic advisory to the person who in this case is going to be excavating. And I had to redact a bunch of stuff, but this advisory goes out to that person, because we know when we collected the information, we got the phone number and the email address for that person. That person gets an advisory, and maybe the state goes, that's good enough for this case, or maybe they decide to do more things. If it's a private company, it takes different. The process goes different ways. Sometimes they send someone to the site to say, hey, we just want to watch your excavation and make sure it's okay. Yeah, so I could talk for a long time about how the alerts come and how they get managed, but generally, you go, hey, something's happening. Here's some details about it. You can take it from there, and we can help you. And there's different. I'm not going through them all. There's different ways we support or not support depending on the client's preferences. And then ultimately, there's at your sites a lot of stuff happens. There's a lot of alerts, so there's ways to just go in and see all your sites, see what happened. Whether it was when the alert happened, when the alert ended. I didn't talk about that, but every time we send an alert out, we always want to end it. So it either ends with not a problem, or I took care of it, or whatever the resolution was, it gets tracked in that chat box I was showing earlier, so that at the end of the day, this is all kind of there's a record of all these things, and then there's reports that show just show all the metrics of there was hundreds of events at your sites, a few of them rose to the level of alerts, and blah blah blah. It's important stuff, but I got to kind of blow through some of it. And then on a site specific level, you can go, oh, let me see my site. Geez, there's six things happened, and I can see some graphs about what the events were like. Was it excavation? Was it some real estate, and so forth. So I am going to this case example just flies through kind of the same thing. You get your site, you have your monitoring categories. Oh, these are the 6 things I want you guys to monitor for me. In this case, building permits, construction data, foreclosure, and we've worked this out during the setup phase. And then I can see, how my monitoring's been progressed through whatever time frame it's been going on, monitoring history, alert history. These are all just tools to see what's happened. And really just management tools. And I think I have one example of this is kind of how an alert flow goes. You get the alert, and then it goes through this process I was talking about, where we send it to you. They go, oh, we took some protective actions. This is what we did, and now we're good. Nothing further needs to be done. And so this is all tracked in the system. I'm going to leave it there because I don't want to. Yeah, I definitely think. And if we have time, there's a lot more of stuff like that.